Hi, I'm Jim Hightower, and I'm hoping that you will tune in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour because it will turn you radioactive.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrowan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, a program you're going to need to listen to if you drink water.
First up, we welcome back labor organizer Chris Townsend. We had Chris on the show back in November of 2024, right after Donald Trump was elected. And we asked him about the state of the labor movement and how organized labor could and should act as a countervailing force, pushing back against the Trump administration's labor policies. What is Trump's position on labor? Well, here he is during an August 2024 discussion about government spending, praising Elon Musk for firing workers who went on strike.
I mean, I look at what you do. You walk in and you just say, you want to quit? They go on strike. I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike and you say, that's okay, you're all gone. You're all gone. So every one of you is gone.
Now that we're 6 months into the Trump administration, we'll get Chris Townsend's assessment of the situation and how the labor movement can push back. Then we'll welcome journalist Mariah Blake, author of the new book, They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Her book builds on a shocking Mother Jones expose she wrote back in 2014, which revealed the true hazards of PFAS. Her whistleblower wasn't a corporate insider or government official. Quote, after losing several friends and relatives to cancer, an unassuming insurance underwriter in Hoosick Falls, New York, began to suspect that the local water supply was polluted, unquote. Turns out it was. And lo and behold, the government and the manufacturers of these toxic chemicals, used in everything from lipstick and cookware to children's clothing, had known about their hazards for decades. We'll speak to her about the toxic system that has made us all guinea pigs in a vast, uncontrolled chemistry experiment, and the ordinary people who took on powerful corporations in order to protect the environment and our health. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our indomitable corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, labor movement, labor movement. Wherefore art thou, labor movement? David?
Chris Townsend has been a union member and leader for more than 45 years. He was most recently the Amalgamated Transit Union International Union Organizing Director. Previously, he was an international representative and political action director for the United Electrical Workers Union, and he has held local positions in both the SEIU and UFCW. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Chris Townsend.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Chris. You know, you've had a long career of criticizing mealy-mouthed union leaders who engage in smoke and mirrors instead of really going all out like the old union leaders in past decades used to. And the head of the AFL-CIO recently, Liz Schuler, said about Trump, quote, they're slashing jobs, they're ripping up union contracts, they're cutting services. Trump's delivered on nothing that he promised. We would say his scorecard is a fail. And she called the executive order of Trump to destroy union bargaining rights for 1 million federal employees, quote, the biggest assault against labor in our history, end quote, Schuler said. Well, given that, Chris, you think that they would have mass rallies around the White House. They would have 24-hour vigils around the White House. You think that they would be far more militant around the country than simply joining rallies with signs saying hands off. You're talking about organized unions with staff, with resources, steel workers, auto workers, textile workers, federal employees, and you think they're really going through the motions. Give us your views on this, given the urgency of the biggest assault on labor by any American president in U.S. history.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph, and hello again, and appreciate you examining this series of questions because it doesn't get examined. And I'm going to start with an unlikely contrast, unlikely for me, you too probably. Even our decrepit and bankrupt Democratic Party, in its current balkanized condition, a mess, defeat, disarray, demoralization, even that organization, so to speak, is engaging in a version of an internal discussion about what is the new direction, perhaps what were the mistakes of the other directions. It's not you have your own opinions about it. I wouldn't see it as the same kind of examination of that crisis that I might have, but I'm not a Democrat. But I look at it from the outside and I think, okay, no such discussion happens in the labor movement. The number of public spokespersons or people who can gain some public time who will actually thoughtfully critique anything that's going on in the labor movement is minute. And I find myself, I do a lot of things, even as a retiree. This is year 46 for me in the labor movement. And I'm still working 100 hours a week on trade union matters, but now as a retiree and as a volunteer. But I only do spend a few hours or a month perhaps thinking about changes in the labor movement or whatnot. I'm too busy dealing with the immediate battles, organizing the unorganized primarily. And I think this is maybe what really is lacking amongst broad numbers. Not all. All of this is somewhat, there are exceptions, of course, in our labor movement today, but we have seen rise to preeminence. Notice that I didn't say elect, because most unions, the election process is very truncated. It's a formality. It becomes a selection process for many of these folks, not all again, but we've moved up an administrative layer of labor leaders, time markers, folks who see their role as at best guiding the sinking ship, managing the decline, taking best care as they can think of the members as their lives are destroyed, as the employers move to liquidate us. Now Trump. And for decades, as you know, and probably most listeners know, the labor movement has been a punching bag for attack after attack after attack, including attacks from our so-called Democratic allies. I remind folks at this time, most of all, I just did in an interview that I gave to the Monthly Review online magazine, that the Democrats, through their conduct, their deliberate anti-worker conduct, have built the platform for Trump. They helped to create him in many significant ways. So here we are now dealing with what Elizabeth Schuler, head of the AFL-CIO, I would argue the least qualified labor leader that I can think of, maybe would find a few shop steward level folks thrust into the position with no great experience or preparation. But she is now decrying the awesome attack of the Trump administration regime.
She won't do anything. The labor movement won't do anything the Democratic Party doesn't want done. Isn't that the main problem?
Well, I would say we face several main problems. This is the problem. It would be simple if we only had one. We have a handful. I would say equal, in many ways exceeding the gravity of the political action crisis, our subordination to the Democratic Party, our membership estrangement from the political process, the lack of any significant trade union education of the rank and file, other than a few cheap slogans, the current bus trip unfolding around the country with invigorating slogans like, "It's better in a union." Well, what I have been on a drumbeat for years, and others, I'm not alone in this, is that the crisis that we face is the crisis of our very existence. What the employers, private and public, corporate, have figured out and have purchased through their political and financial largesse is a system where it is far easier to subtract people from the labor movement through plant closings and changes in the economic structure and the workplace structure. It's far easier to shrink the labor movement than it is to build it and grow it. And that's our job. No other force in the country is going to do the work of adding the many millions of unorganized toilers. I use the word toilers very carefully. That seems like an out-of-date, I'm speaking of a guy shoveling coal maybe 120 years ago, but go to the workplace today in the United States, toiling. Toil is really what we've been reduced to, and increasingly so. So there's absolutely, I would indict the labor movement loudly, daily, that there is as yet no understanding that unless we go back out to the unorganized and take the spirit of trade unionism, unity, one for all, take on the employer, organize, defend each other, move forward, recapture some of this gargantuan wealth that we create each day on the job. Unless that spirit is returned into an organizing wave, or at least an attempt to do this, our fate has been sealed. And I think many of the forces on the political terrain, Republican, Democratic Party, the officialdoms, the corporate folks, they just view us as something that it's a little bit longer it's going to take to strangle us. Don't worry, we've got it under control. We've got our hands around their throat. They're not going to push back. They're not going to resist. They're going to have an asinine bus tour around the country to take some pictures and give the appearance of some trade union leaders doing something about this crisis. This is unheard of. This thing that Sister Schuler mentions with the federal workers is all too correct. In one swoop, Donald Trump wiped away 500,000 union members by canceling the contracts and the dues checkoff of all of the federal unions.
The Economic Policy Institute had a report, very well-regarded group in Washington, D.C., 100 Ways Trump has hurt workers in his first 100 days. And it really is amazing when you see, obviously, he's blocked any increase in the minimum wage, which is 7.25 federal, ridiculous. He's limited workers' collective bargaining agreements, if not trying to destroy them. He's wiped out the National Labor Relations Board, firing its chair, and doesn't even have a quorum to deal with labor management disputes. He's proposed rolling back the rights of more than 45,000 workers to TSA that monitor our airports. You imagine that? Nothing's off limits. He rescinded the Good Jobs executive order, which was supposed to improve job quality for millions of jobs protected by recent federal public works or investments. He's terminated Department of Labor grants that fight forced and child labor, imagine, and promote workers' rights. He took back an executive order on expanding registered apprenticeships in federally funded projects. He rescinded an executive order that gave almost 400,000 low-wage federal contractors a living wage. He even gutted Worker Safety Agency, the National Safety Health Research Group.
I'll just blurt this out. We're only 15 to 20% into his term. And this is the ghastly record of carnage that's been heaped on us. And again, it comes back to, I'm not surprised that bosses act like this. They're bosses. You know, for listeners out there, everyone has their own story. I went to work as a kid. College never entered into my life at all. I went right from high school to the workplace. It's the biggest dictatorship of all. Newsflash, the workplace in the United States is a damn dictatorship, which is why I see such a key role in stimulating workplace rebellion called union organizing. That's what it is. There's no way to pussyfoot around this, tiptoe around it. You're organizing workers to collectively challenge the unchecked, complete power of the bosses in the workplace, whether it's public, private, it doesn't matter. And here we are now with a president who expresses a greater class consciousness than the labor leadership. Trump and his minions are not ambivalent about their class interests. They see us as the dangerous force that we are, should we become activated. And yet at this point in time, we have a labor leadership. And again, there are exceptions. I want to say that. But the preeminent thinking going around, certainly animating this asinine bus tour that's going on around the country, is one of administrative patience. Let's decry the evil and the unfairness. Let's have another lawsuit someplace. Virtually no mention of organizing the over 100 million unorganized workers. Now, these forces in labor are very frequent to mention the public opinion polls that for my entire life have validated our existence by revealing that the vast majority of the working class would join a union and participate if it had the legal actual right to do so, if it wasn't repressed and met with firings and mass repression from employers when it happens. So I guess for all of the listeners who may not know this, you know, when Brother Nader, when you, myself, when others decry the Democratic Party control, the straitjacket that the labor movement is, it's real. It's real in many ways. It's real, and this becomes part of the problem, the staffing of the AFL-CIO, the staffing of many of the unions. These are people who come through political consultants, Democratic Party. They come through the DNC. They recycle around. Come to Washington, D.C. I'll take folks down to Capitol Hill, and you'll see this staffing merry-go-round between labor and Democrats and all of the campaign machinery that's out there. So that there's literally virtually no political thinking that goes on in the AFL-CIO.
Give us the reading on Capitol Hill. Any light there? Any progressive effort? You have Bernie Sanders, you have AOC, you have a growing core. Give us your reading on Congress.
I'll do that, and I think it is instructive, and I think like most of the conventional wisdom that the elites in both parties peddle, it's wrong. The anecdotal evidence that I see out there is that Trump had no mandate. He barely was elected. The disgust level with Harris and Biden and the whole history of how we ended up where we are sapped any enthusiasm for the Democratic ticket. So we find ourselves now with Donald Trump a second time, delivered to us in many ways because of that Democratic Party misleadership. And he rules now for the last 6 months as a failing Roman emperor. I mean, this is not just a off the wall analogy. This man is governing in a la Roman style, decree, debauchery, lurching from one to the next, turning on allies, making unlikely allies. It is just disregarding all decorum and whatnot. And this is his style of operation. Well, this is only just beginning now. Imagine where we might be a year from now or 2 years from now. But all of this happens. And the Democratic Party, as I had said, and I don't mean that as a compliment, there's at least some internal discussion and debate about what the hell happened. How could we have bungled that election? How could we have lost to Donald Trump a second time? But again, in the labor movement, when there is virtually no debate, no discussion, I venture to say I'm banned for life from any participation in anything that the AFL does, only solely based on the fact that I speak up. I'm one of the most successful union organizers and political staffers you'll ever run into in terms of the numbers. I can demonstrate that, but that doesn't matter. Numbers don't matter. What matters is bootlicking loyalty to a corporate line or a Democratic Party line. And it really is a sobering moment. Now, as to the question of what's going on out in the hustings in the real world outside of the Beltway, I'm going to use an example from my home county. I consider Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sort of my home county. I wasn't born there. My father moved us there from central Pennsylvania in 1964 because in 1964, the little burg that I lived in, Tyrone, was collapsing even then because of this political corporate misleadership. My dad takes us down to Lancaster County. I grow up. Well, anyway, you won't find a more conservative, staid, stuck in a time warp county than Lancaster County. That in recent decades has become not just Trump supporters in large measure, it's become religiously attached to a Donald Trump. It's very distressing to see many of the previously somewhat legitimate religious elements up there, Anabaptists and whatnot, and many others, just completely fall for Trump. That said, just a couple months ago in what they call East Petersburg, it's on the west side of Lancaster County, in one of the special state Senate elections, a completely unknown Democrat rocketed to victory. I believe it's the 23rd district. His name is Malone. No one had ever heard of this guy. He was a sacrificial lamb put up by the Democrats, which they've always done in Lancaster County. And yet he rockets to a significant victory because why? Because huge numbers of working class people across the country, and most of all in that core Trumpist area, have taken a few breaths and said, oh my, now we've elected a failing, dying Roman emperor who wants to sacrifice all of us for his lunacies. And maybe in Lancaster County, it was his handling of agricultural policy, tariffs, his debased morality and whatnot. Oh, finally, this pops through the surface and it's shown. Now, I deal with a lot of media like you do, and I have been sending every reporter, national and international, to that part of the world to say, if this is an election that can be won in the ensuing couple of elections, even Democrats, let alone independent forces, should be rocketing, leapfrogging, pushing aside these degraded Republican elements. I mean, all the chemistry is here. Now, the question is, will the Democrats or will independent forces? It's a different question. Would the Democrats recognize this? I doubt they will. And in terms of independent forces, and Brother Nader, you have great experience with this, and all of the roadblocks that both parties will construct, the one thing they agree on is that all independent forces have to be extinguished. So Where will we go in the coming elections? At this point in time, I'm not optimistic. And now optimism isn't required here. I'm not wealthy enough to give up. That's the punchline for all of us as the working class. We're not rich enough to sit this out. Both parties are discredited beyond repair in different ways, sometimes similar ways. But the dilemma, and I see this in my movement, the labor movement, which is there's no belief that if they would win, that they would actually do anything. We've seen the labor movement, working class people have seen again and again and again for decades now, Democrats winning, holding majorities, and failing, and then keyword, refusing to perform by either challenging corporate power, going after it, or delivering in terms of what labor needs. And it comes back to new organizing. You know, we've had labor law reform stalled, going nowhere for 65, 70 years. And this is what prevents us in some measure from being able to grow and grow again. And the issue is, you know, how are we going to hold together? At this point in time, we're talking about holding together a ragtag coalition just to prevent Trump from usurping all power at this point in time. I mean, these are breathtaking things to consider. But again, in the Democratic Party, it's bankrupt. It's bankrupt. And you mentioned a few of the...
It may be bankrupt, but if the people organize and unions organize on a compact for American workers and families, they'll see a winning issue. They'll see a winning issue enough to win in 2026. They're not all crazy, you know.
Of course, it's early. We have elections, statewide elections in New Jersey, and here where I live in Virginia at the end of this year, November. There are going to be some local elections and whatnot. Then we'll have the big national congressional elections next year. But all I'm putting forward is that if the Democrats think that repackaging what they have is the minimum job that they have to do, it won't work.
No, they have to make it authentic. But we don't leave it up to the Democratic Party. That's what all those union locals, that's what all the citizen groups, that's what all those people who are marching can make the issue. From the bottom up, this is what we want. We demand it, period. Otherwise, you're gone.
I'll conclude with this, maybe just as a quick aside at the end here. I see my mission as thoroughly destabilizing this decrepit, ossified labor leadership. And I have actually sort of shifted for a few weeks away from just a solitary focus on organizing the unorganized to now factionally challenging people. How can this be? How can these two leaders of the AFL have no pushback? Where is the vitality and life within that executive council of the AFL? I am a very unlikely guy to do that because I'm never been part of that and I don't live in that rarefied air, but I happen to know enough of it. And I just want to mention one thing, Brother Nader, for you. You know, our friend Sean Fain at the Auto Workers is now, you know, the tide is turning against him. And I just want to mention that the role of our federal government in that, because there's a federal monitor. That's an entire other discussion. How the hell does this federal monitor just sit there, paid for by the members of the union in perpetuity? We lived with this for 40 years with the Teamsters. Now we have a version of it here, and they're not ambivalent about whether Sean Fain would push back. All of us have an opinion about him or his pluses and minuses, but this is going to unfold in the next few months. And the old regime, with the full support of the federal monitor, is going to try to mount a comeback and take that union right back into the sewer, subtract them from whatever things they've begun to do. So anyway, that's just the story.
No, we have to conclude. Keep on going, Chris Townsend. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much.
We've been speaking to Chris Townsend. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we're going to talk to investigative journalist Mariah Blake about how forever chemicals poisoned the world. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 8, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A Florida jury found Tesla was partly to blame in a fatal 2019 collision involving vehicle equipped with the company's driver assistance software, awarding the plaintiffs nearly $329 million in damages. It marks the first time a jury has awarded damages in a lawsuit related to Tesla's driver assistance features. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. The jury concluded the automaker failed to provide sufficient warnings or instructions for its autopilot feature in the 2019 Tesla Model S involved in the accident, making the car unreasonably dangerous. Tesla designed autopilot only for controlled access highways, yet deliberately chose not to restrict drivers from using it elsewhere, said Brett Schreiber, an attorney for the plaintiffs. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Skrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest is going to tell us about Forever Chemicals. David?
Mariah Blake is an investigative journalist whose writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The New Republic, and other publications. She was a Murray Martyr Neiman Fellow in Watchdog Journalism at Harvard University, and she is the author of They Poison the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mariah Blake.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Mariah. And when you say they poisoned the world, that is not an overstatement. These forever chemicals, which we're going to define, have found their way in every human being on Earth and mammals in the natural world. This is a saturation chemical, and it doesn't degrade, and it just eats at people's health. And while your book has a lot of material on a small town in New York State whose drinking water was seriously contaminated by these chemicals, and how ordinary citizens revolted, built a movement that spread around the country, and also got a standard to protect their own drinking water. You also talk about the history and how these chemicals found important uses in the munitions industry and in firefighting foam, for example, that are routinely deployed at airports. So let's get underway by asking you to define these forever chemicals. And then I'm going to ask you, how has this cluster of chemicals escaped comprehensive attention for many decades?
So, forever chemicals, also known as per-N polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are a large family of chemicals with some pretty amazing properties. So they're extremely resistant to heat, stains, water, grease, electrical currents. They stand up to corrosive chemicals that burn through virtually every other material, including in some cases steel. And this makes them extremely useful. And as a result, they found their way into thousands of everyday products. On the other hand, they are probably the most insidious pollutants in all of human history. So they stay in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years. Those that have been studied are highly toxic, even in the most minuscule of doses. And they are literally polluting the entire planet, as you mentioned, including human blood and ecosystems in the remotest parts of the world. So I think the clearest example of this comes from a 2020 study of rainwater. A group of prominent European scientists looked at rainwater around the world, and they found everywhere in the world, including the remotest regions, places like the Tibetan Plateau, the levels were high enough to endanger human health and the environment. So, for example, the levels were higher than the EPA's safety standards for these chemicals. The same is true of breast milk in many countries. So this is a global problem that affects every single one of us.
Let's go to the question of what you call the cozy relationship between the chemical industry and the munition industry, where you say some of the worst contamination anywhere is around U.S. military bases. What is the role of DuPont here, and what was the established principle by DuPont-funded scientists who put off regulatory action as a result for many years?
So there are a couple of questions in there. So one is the issue of how we regulate chemicals in this country. So DuPont has shaped that deeply. The chemical industry has shaped our system for regulating potentially toxic substance. And in fact, it was a DuPont-funded scientist who first articulated the principle that underlies our system for regulating toxic chemicals, and that is that they should be presumed safe until proven otherwise.
The burden of proof is not on the producer or the seller of these companies. It's on the public at large, which doesn't have the resources to reverse.
So under the main law governing chemicals in this country, toxic chemicals, all of the chemicals that were in existence when it passed were presumed safe and grandfathered in. And even new chemicals didn't have to be tested for safety. So as a result, and this is something I found shocking when I first discovered it, the vast majority of the 80,000 chemicals that are on the market in the United States today have never undergone any form of safety testing.
These chemicals have functional uses, And in reading through your book, I recall a statement by Barry Commoner, the wonderful scientist and political activist who used to teach at Washington University. And he told me once that he is on the verge of writing a book making the case to abolish the petrochemical industry. I said, Barry, what do you mean abolish? He says, yes, because its damaging effects are so vast, so latent, so much silent violence, so unsusceptible to regulatory action in time that it vastly overrides any benefit. And he said, by the way, almost everything that the petrochemical industry can do can be substituted by renewable materials. Well, he never got around to writing that book, unfortunately. But your book illustrates, in my mind, the validity of what he's saying. Basically, that you can't regulate piecemeal this industry. There are too many chemicals, thousands of, as you pointed out, unregulated. Together, the impact that they have as they mix with each other is not regulated. You have to look at it generically. What is your view of that?
Well, I certainly think that the way we regulate chemicals in this country at the moment makes zero sense. You do see changes happening in response to the unique threat posed by these chemicals on a state level, and this is really in response to citizen activism. So a number of states are passing laws that have banned the entire class of chemicals. That is not how we regulate chemicals in this country normally. We normally regulate them one by one. But at this moment, 30 US states have passed at least 170 laws restricting PFAS, including 16 full or partial bans on the entire class of chemicals in consumer goods. And you have another 200 plus states that are weighing regulations. Even deep red states like Texas, Oklahoma, Montana are weighing crackdowns. And Europe is also weighing a class-wide ban on PFAS. So I think one of the most interesting dimensions of this story is that it has given rise to this powerful citizen activism movement, and they are driving real change. I think that is moving us closer towards turning off the tap on these chemicals. And also, I think they are a beacon. They show us how we could potentially regulate other classes of chemicals in ways that better protect the public health. And that means, and what I mean by that is regulating chemicals as a class, because there are classes of chemicals that are known to be harmful. There's a vast body of science showing that BPA and other phenols are harmful.
Just for terminology purposes, you and others refer to these cluster of chemicals as PFAS. And you have 3 chapters that reveal the manufacturers have been secretly studying the impact of PFAS on human health and the environment since the 1960s.
Yes.
And covering up their damning findings. So you do deal with the cover-up, but fast forward to today, the chemical industry is defiant and they own the Trump regime. So you have big business and big government opposing the citizen movement and state actions around the country. And one of the techniques the chemical industry uses, as you point out in your book, they poisoned the world, life and death in an age of forever chemicals, is, in your words, they pick apart the science tying lucrative products to disease. And you expose how DuPont and other companies use these tactics, which they taught the tobacco industry how to use, to avoid regulation. Explain that.
Well, I think it's worth pausing to just discuss the industry cover-up and the specifics of it. So industry, the main manufacturers of these chemicals, 3M and DuPont, have known since the 1960s that they were toxic. They have known since the 1970s that they were in the blood of people all over this country, including in areas where there was no known source of exposure. When they discovered that these chemicals were in the blood of virtually every American, it set off a panic inside the industry. And they started really intensively studying these chemicals, PFAS. They quickly discovered that they didn't break down in nature, that they had a devastating impact on lab animals. So in one case, 3M tested them on monkeys, which it chose because they're more biologically similar to humans than lab rats. The study had to be aborted early because all of the monkeys died. 3M and DuPont did similar research on their own workers. They found that these chemicals were linked to kidney cancer, prostate cancer, leukemia, organ damage, and immune suppression, as well as birth defects. So In the 1980s, DuPont began monitoring the pregnancies of workers in its Teflon factories to determine whether this chemical, a specific PFAS, caused birth defects. And it discovered, in fact, that it seemed to. So 2 of 7 pregnant women who gave birth during the course of the study gave birth to children with facial deformities very similar to the facial deformities that 3M had discovered in rats exposed to these chemicals. So industry withheld this information for decades. And the only reason it eventually came to light is because a family of West Virginia farmers who had sold DuPont some acreage for a landfill and had their cows die off afterwards sued the company. And that really exposed this breathtaking cover-up involving a specific forever chemical known as PFOA. But really, I think that is when the world became aware that this class of chemicals existed. And at that point, the EPA began scrutinizing DuPont. And then, yes, it and 3M, the 2 main manufacturers, both deployed these tobacco industry style tactics to manipulate the science, to control what went in the scientific literature. And that delayed regulation by decades, or it helped to delay regulation.
Let's go to Congress. There's been activity, believe it or not, listeners, in Congress, not definitive, but they haven't been totally tone deaf on it. Tell us what's been going on with the Congress, hearings, legislation, proposals, and the role of the chemical lobby in blocking any kind of comprehensive deadline mandated action against these chemicals.
So around 2018, and when this citizen movement really started to gain steam, partially because people during that period were learning their drinking water was contaminated. So at this point, nearly half of all Americans are known to be drinking water that's contaminated with these chemicals. But that was not the case until relatively recently. And I should say that that is certainly an underestimate because a large share of public water supplies in this country have not been tested. But when you had people start to demand action from their members of Congress, and I'm talking about people of every imaginable background, firefighters, farmers, factory workers, suburban moms, pastors, people of all classes and political backgrounds, in 2018 or so, you had a huge volume of legislation that began cropping up in Congress. And this was bipartisan legislation during the first Trump administration. And it looked like a lot of these bills were going to pass as part of the must-pass military spending bill, but most of them got stripped out at the last moment. And that was due largely to industry maneuvering. 3M in particular put together a front group called the Responsible Science Policy Coalition that took internal industry science and packaged it into briefing materials. So this group was ostensibly an independent organization that went around lobbying Congress and downplaying the health effects of these chemicals. And that and industry lobbying seemed to be incredibly effective in killing most of this legislation. Now, I should say that because these chemicals are used in so many products, there were a lot of powerful industries that were lobbying against legislation, including the oil and gas industry, which uses PFAS and fracking, the American Water Works Association, because some of these laws would have put a financial burden on water utilities. So the fact that they're so ubiquitous actually makes them harder to regulate.
The amazing thing is the families of all these lobbyists have got these chemicals in their own bodies, their own kids, their own infants. I mean, don't they crank that into their daily mission as to how they're going to confront efforts by citizens around the country to ban and regulate these chemicals? I mean, how oblivious can you be? These oil and gas executives and lobbyists in Washington, their own families are being contaminated. Have you ever had an exchange with them on this?
I haven't, and I struggle to understand the mentality. There was one person I interviewed for my book who gave me some insight as to the perspective of executives. And this was a lawyer for the company that's responsible for the pollution in Hoosick Falls, New York. And that company is St. Gobain. And he wound up becoming a whistleblower. And I asked him, what are these executives thinking, because yes, their own families are affected. And he said what I was witnessing, what he was witnessing was something he described as a generational passing of the buck. So they know these chemicals are harmful. They know that there's potential legal repercussions of producing them and dumping them in the environment. But their thinking is by the time the consequences come home to roost, they will be retired in the Hamptons. And that is the closest I've come to understanding the mentality of the people who are continuing to produce these chemicals and put them out in the environment, and the lobbyists who are fighting to avoid the regulation of these chemicals. But really, it's a bit of a mystery to me.
Here's a practical question for our listeners that some may be asking right now. What do? They can drink water out of their faucet, or they can drink water from underground wells like Berkeley Springs in West Virginia and elsewhere. And bottled water is sold in all the supermarkets. Overwhelmingly, it's sold in plastic containers. So what would you advise our listeners to do? Take it out of the faucet and put it into a filter, activated carbon, or if they want to buy their water from springs, what do they do about the plastic bottles that contain the water?
That's a really good question. I just want to point out that people are exposed to these chemicals in a lot of ways. So the main route of exposure for most Americans is food. Our food supply is heavily contaminated with these chemicals. We're also exposed through consumer products. So they are in lipstick, lotion, personal care products, diapers, children's clothing. They're in everything.
What kind of food?
Imagine all kinds of food. So for decades, the EPA has been encouraging farmers to spread sewage sludge over their land as fertilizer. And recently it has come to light that this fertilizer is highly contaminated with PFAS. And in fact, there are farms out there that have levels of contamination that blow away any factory town out there. Some of them are organic farms where this sludge was spread 2 or 3 owners ago. But it also gets into the food chain through other routes. So for example, fish tend to be highly, highly contaminated. One study of locally caught freshwater fish around the United States found that eating even a single portion can increase your blood level as much as drinking heavily contaminated water for an entire month. So that said, there are ways that people can protect themselves. And I would say when it comes to drinking water, the best option is just to filter your tap water with a system that is certified to remove PFAS. Under sink systems are a great option. They're relatively affordable. You can avoid buying products that are marketed as waterproof, greaseproof, and stain resistant. I would also advise people to use natural materials for cooking and food storage. So glass, stainless steel, wood utensils, those are all great options. Limit your consumption of fast food and popcorn because the packaging often contains very high levels of PFAS. And avoid eating locally caught freshwater fish.
What sort of diseases are being linked? I know one is kidney cancer. What sort of diseases are being linked?
Various cancers, including kidney and testicular cancer, infertility, obesity, thyroid disease, diabetes, reduced IQ, immune suppression, life-threatening pregnancy complications, and they've also been shown to hinder fetal development. The list is very long, but those are some examples.
Let me ask you a fundamental question. Back in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Thomas Alva Edison, Henry Ford the first, some said the president of Harvard University at the time, they all got together confronting the rise of the chemical industry at the time. And they made a point that just about everything that the chemical industry is producing, hydrocarbons, they were all hydrocarbons, coal, oil, gas, can be produced by carbohydrates, like the products grown on our farms that are degradable and safe. And guess who won out? Well, the chemical industry, DuPont, Dow Chemical, they just overrode those caveats and the way to substitute safely for these dangerous hydrocarbon-based products. And of course, the industry wanted to make money, and they made money by burning coal, oil, and gas. They didn't make money by growing crops on the farms that could be used as substitute materials. And the farm lobby was not organized at that point to counteract the rising chemical industry. Do you see any discussion about substitute renewable, degradable technology here?
Yes, quite a bit. So PFAS are actually not hydrocarbons, but fluorocarbons. So they're a combination of fluorine and carbon, which together form the strongest bond in chemistry. So they have some special properties that other materials don't. And there are certain uses, there are certain applications that we have not yet discovered natural materials that can do what they do. And one of those is lithium ion batteries. So fluorocarbons are used to coat the cathodes, and we do not yet have a non-toxic biodegradable substitute. But for the vast majority of uses, there are substitutes out there, and we're discovering that because, as I mentioned, there are all these state-level bans and an EU ban on the entire class of chemicals. And as a result, manufacturers are having to go through their entire supply chain and figure out where these chemicals are. And if they want an exemption, some of the state level laws exempt uses that are essential to the health, safety, and functioning of society. They have to prove that they're essential and also that there are no substitutes yet available. And we're discovering that for the vast majority of applications, there are substitutes available or substitutes are being developed. There are lots of cases also where these chemicals are used, but they're used in makeup and lotion and cleaning products. They're used wantonly. They're used in ways that don't justify putting these chemicals into the environment. So yes, there is a major conversation happening about substitution, substituting natural materials or biodegradable non-toxic materials. And there are, in many cases, already materials in existence that can be used in place of PFAS.
Well, that gets to the real heart of the problem. That's a generic remedy that we should pay much more attention to. Now, the heart of your book, you said, is the Hoosick Falls, New York narrative. This tiny town, Hoosick Falls, Hoosick Falls, and you describe in many pages in the book what you call the moving story of a group of small town residents who took on some of the world's powerful corporations at great personal expense and wound up scoring some remarkable victories. Can you give a brief narrative about what you thought was such a hopeful resurgence of what you call citizen scientists?
It's a pretty remarkable story. And actually, when I set out to write this book, I had written an article about the Parkersburg, West Virginia case that I mentioned. And I really thought that was going to be the focus of my story, that and the history of PFAS. I thought that would be the focus of my book. But as I began researching my book, and this is 8 years ago, stories about Hoosick Falls began cropping up in the media. At the time, nobody had even heard of PFAS, and there was only a few communities anywhere in the country that were known to have PFAS drinking water contamination. But this community had discovered that the drinking water was contaminated. And as you mentioned, it only came to light because this local insurance underwriter began to suspect that the drinking water was contaminated after his father died from kidney cancer. And so he tested his own drinking water, and he discovered that in fact, the water was highly contaminated. The levels he detected were about 100 times the EPA's current safety standard. And he thought he would just take the information to the mayor and that the mayor would take it from there. But that's not what happened. He ended up spearheading a fight against several giant multinational corporations and government agencies to get his community clean drinking water. And one of the things that I love about Michael and that really struck me when I first met him is that he is the least likely activist you can ever imagine. So he's clean cut, he drives a BMW SUV, he's never taken much interest in politics or environmental issues. The first time I met him, he told me he got his political news from ESPN, and yet he had become this really remarkable advocate. And other community residents had joined the fight. There was a local doctor, very beloved figure in the community, who had detected unusually high rates of rare aggressive cancer among his patients before being diagnosed with cancer himself at age 41. There was a young mother who had put everything she had into a dream home for her family, only to discover that the private well was heavily contaminated with these chemicals, that her family had blood levels on par with DuPont factory workers. There was a high school music teacher, a conservative evangelical Christian, who was devastated to discover that his breastfed 2-year-old daughter had blood levels that were 30 times the national average. And these were people very much like Michael, people who had never taken much of an interest in politics, who'd spent their lives trusting that there were systems in place to protect them. And now that trust had been shattered, but rather than becoming cynical or resigned, they fought like hell to protect their families. And along the way, they discovered these hidden strengths that turned them into really remarkable advocates. So Michael had this incredible talent for maneuvering behind the scenes.
They testified before Congress, didn't they?
He testified before Congress. Both he and Emily Marpe, the young woman whose private well was poisoned, she was a teen mom, high school education. She developed a command on the science that blew me away, and she became a very powerful spokesperson. They all lobbied Congress. Both she and Michael testified before Congress, and they were remarkably effective advocates. So the high school music teacher, he wound up becoming mayor, and he turned things around for the village.
What is the population of Hoosick Falls, and where does the drinking water come from?
So it is 3,000 people, and the drinking water comes from groundwater wells that are right next to the plant that manufactures Teflon-coated fabric.
We're talking with Mariah Blake, who's the author of the very compelling book, They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in an Age of Forever Chemicals, by Crown Publishers, a major publisher, and it's doing very well around the country in terms of sales. Can you tell us how people can contact you, give you their dire situation, perhaps in their community?
People can reach me. My email address is on my Instagram page, and just to connect with me via Instagram or Facebook. I just want to mention in terms of the Hoosick Falls story, you know, Michael and the doctor that he was working with early on, the beloved community doctor, had a list of goals that they set out in 2015 for their community, what they wanted in terms of getting the community clean drinking water and medical monitoring for the diseases associated with PFAS. And as of this year, they have achieved every single goal. And they've also shaped state legislation and federal legislation.
We understand the power of the civic action here in your book out of Hoosick Falls, New York. Let's go to Steve. Question for Mariah Blake.
Mariah, what are the Montreal protocols?
So the Montreal Protocol was an agreement to phase out chlorofluorocarbons. These were the gases responsible for the ozone hole, and it was remarkably effective. So a bunch of countries signed on to the protocol, and we were able to phase out the majority of CFCs. And as a result, the ozone hole is on its way to recovery. So I believe within the next 2 decades, it will disappear entirely. And I think it's more importantly, it is one of the clearest examples of effective environmental regulation, of actually regulation that addresses a severe environmental threat and that is successful.
And it can be applied to PFAS.
Well, I argue in the book, I mean, I mainly make the case that the Montreal Protocol was only possible because market forces were shifting in a way that encouraged manufacturers to be willing to phase out these chemicals. And in fact, so DuPont was also the main manufacturer of chlorofluorocarbons. And once the market reached a point where it was more lucrative to produce the replacements than to produce chlorofluorocarbons, DuPont actually lobbied for a more aggressive timeline for the phase out of these chemicals. And that is how the world was able to reach this agreement and implement it so successfully. And I make the case in the book that we are approaching a similar tipping point with PFAS, or we could be approaching a similar tipping point with PFAS, because you have this combination of state level legislation restricting PFAS. You have a tidal wave of litigation. So there are at least 15,000 lawsuits against manufacturers. And as a result of this, large swaths of the economy are voluntarily migrating away from PFAS. So 3M, the world's largest manufacturer, has announced that it will quit producing them by the end of this year, which is huge. 40 major retail chains with more than $1.7 trillion in sales have announced that they will phase them out or eliminate them from their supply chains. And we're talking huge companies: Apple, Amazon, Home Depot, 7-Eleven. The list is quite long. And so as a result of that, I think we are reaching a point where the economic incentive shifts enough that finding replacements is so lucrative that continuing to use these products presents such a huge liability, because now consumer brands are starting to get sued for using these chemicals in their products.
David?
So the John Birch Society is slowly becoming normalized. More and more cities are actually banning fluoride from our drinking water, not fluorine. And you write that fluorine is an element known as the devil's gas, whereas fluoride for our teeth is an offshoot of an ion of fluorine. So why is it okay for fluoride to be in our water, but not fluorine? And how do we get the John Birchers to care more about the fluorine in our water than the fluoride?
That's a good question. I mean, the thing is that, yes, fluoride is just a fluorine ion, and fluoride is extremely toxic above a certain dose, but scientists have discovered that lower doses are protective of our teeth. Now, I think that's a very good question. Why are people like RFK concerned about fluoride in our water, but not these fluorinated chemicals that are known to be extremely harmful? And I would love to see the Maha people and Kennedy embracing this issue, because I think it's one that Republicans and Democrats alike care about on the grassroots level, and it's one that affects us all. But I don't know why they have chosen to care about fluorine and not PFAS, except for that the fluorine debate goes back decades, and PFAS have really only registered on the radar in the last, I'd say, 5-6 years.
We're out of time. Unfortunately, we've been speaking with Mariah Blake, the author of They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in an Age of Forever Chemicals. These are examples of the silent violence of corporate production. And silent violence is often secret violence, and it's very hard to expose compared to, say, to street crime, which is why corporations get away with so much without having to be confronted by the rule of regulatory law and substitute materials for their harmful products. Thank you very much, Mariah, and may you reach millions more people with your practical advice about how people can protect themselves and get state action until we fire the Trump administration, which has now collaborated with these chemical companies in many destructive ways, harmful to the health of all Americans, regardless of whether they voted for or against Trump. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Chris Townsend and Mariah Blake. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up. You've been saying, I think you should step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down.